There was, in the village of Rosehill, a settled belief that nothing truly dreadful could occur on a Wednesday afternoon in June. The church fair had been arranged for weeks with the kind of determined cheerfulness peculiar to English villages. Notices had appeared in every shop window. Cakes had been baked in alarming quantities. Elderly ladies had argued fiercely over jam classifications, while Colonel Ashcombe declared 3 separate times that the coconut shy had been improperly managed ever since 1938. By 2:30, the vicarage lawn had become a cheerful confusion of striped tents, folding chairs, and respectable gossip. Miss Jane Marple, seated beneath a pale green parasol beside the tea-table, observed the proceedings with gentle attention. She wore a lavender-grey dress and a small straw hat decorated with faded violets. To most people she appeared exactly what she was supposed to appear, a harmless elderly lady with knitting in her lap and a fondness for seed-cake. Only a very few people understood that Miss Marple missed almost nothing. "It's such a relief we've had good weather," said Mrs. Bellamy, pouring tea in nervous little splashes. "Last year everything blew over entirely." "Yes," said Miss Marple mildly, "though sometimes unfortunate things happen in perfectly lovely weather. Human nature is not really influenced by sunshine, I find." Mrs. Bellamy blinked uncertainly and moved away to attend to a plate of scones. Across the lawn, children shrieked around the hoop-toss stall while the village band attempted something martial and failed halfway through. Beyond the hedges lay Orchard Lane, a narrow road lined with old chestnut trees and deep gardens hidden behind brick walls. Rose Hill itself was the sort of village that strangers described as charming and residents described as inconvenient. There were climbing roses around nearly every cottage. The post office still sold penny sweets in glass jars. People knew one another's habits with exhausting intimacy, and, Miss Marple reflected, villages were very much alike everywhere. There was always the prosperous family trying to appear more important than they were, the disappointed spinster, the smiling man with debts, the respectable woman with secrets, the young people making foolish romantic entanglements as though no one before them had ever done anything so absurd. Human nature, after all, never changed. A ripple of laughter broke out near the flower competition. Miss Marple glanced over and saw Gerald Fenwick standing beside the roses. Mr. Fenwick was a newcomer to Rosehill, which is to say he had lived there nearly 2 years and was still regarded with mild suspicion. He had purchased Hawthorne House after retiring from business in London, though no one seemed entirely certain what business that had been. He was handsome in a polished, silver-haired fashion, with charming manners and a habit of looking directly at people when they spoke, which many found flattering. The younger women liked him enormously. The older women distrusted him. Miss Marple considered that perfectly sensible. "He's very generous," said Miss Eyes. Pritchard, suddenly settling beside her with a grunt, donated £5 to the church roof fund. "How kind," said Miss Marple. Mrs. Pritchard lowered her voice. "Though where the money comes from is another matter." Miss Marple gave a small encouraging murmur. "It's my belief," continued Mrs. Pritchard, "that no man retires at 52 unless there's something questionable underneath." "That has often proved true," Miss Marple admitted, "though occasionally it is merely indigestion." Mrs. Pritchard looked disappointed by this moderation. Near the lemonade stall stood Diana Harwood, dark-haired and striking in a blue summer dress. She was engaged rather unexpectedly to Hugh Lambert, the local solicitor's nephew. There had been some surprise over the match. Diana had charm and beauty, but very little money. Hugh possessed exactly the reverse qualities. Miss Marple watched as Diana glanced only briefly toward Gerald Fenwick. It was not the glance itself that interested her. It was the speed with which both of them looked away. A small thing. Very often the important things were small. "Miss Marple." The vicar arrived pink-faced and breathless. "I wonder if you'd judge the preserves? Missy Simpkins insists her blackberry jam has been unfairly placed." "That sounds extremely serious," said Miss Marple gravely. Before the vicar could reply, a motor-car appeared at the entrance gates. Its arrival produced the subtle but unmistakable pause that always greeted strangers in villages. The car itself was dusty and dark green. The man who stepped out did not belong in Rosehill. This was instantly obvious. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and perhaps 40. His coat was too heavy for the weather, and his expression carried the alert wariness of someone accustomed to unpleasant situations. Several conversations stopped altogether. The stranger looked slowly across the fete, not curious, Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. The man's eyes rested on Gerald Fenwick, only for a second, but Fenwick's pleasant expression altered very slightly, a tightening around the mouth, quickly hidden. Then the stranger began walking across the lawn. There are moments when ordinary life shifts almost imperceptibly into danger. Later, many people would remember that walk. The band stumbled into silence. A child dropped a paper windmill. Somewhere near the cake stall a woman laughed too loudly. The stranger stopped directly before Gerald Fenwick. Neither man spoke at first. Then the newcomer said quietly, "I thought I might find you here." Fenwick smiled. It was a charming smile. It did not reach his eyes. "I believe you're mistaken." "No," said the man. "I don't think I am." Miss Marple observed several things simultaneously. Diana Harwood had gone completely pale. Hugh Lambert was staring in bewilderment. And Miss Pritchard, who missed absolutely nothing disreputable, had nearly stopped breathing with interest. Fenwick gave a short laugh. "You've confused me with someone else." "Have I?" said the stranger. There was no menace in his tone. That was what made it unsettling. The two men looked at one another. Then Fenwick said lightly, "Perhaps we should speak privately." The stranger nodded. They walked away together toward the gate leading to Orchard Lane. Immediately the fete dissolved into excited murmuring. "Who was he? Did you hear? Something from London, perhaps. Blackmail, I shouldn't wonder. Or military intelligence." "Don't be absurd, Edith." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but she was thinking. The stranger had not behaved like a blackmailer, nor like a creditor. There had been something else in his face, something grim and deeply personal. And Gerald Fenwick, despite all his smooth composure, had looked frightened, not annoyed, not embarrassed, frightened. Miss Marple had seen that same expression once many years ago in St. Mary Mead, just before a bank manager disappeared with church funds and another man's wife. Fear, she reflected, was one of the easiest emotions to recognize. About 20 minutes later the fete attempted to recover its spirit. The brass band resumed with uncertain optimism. Tea continued to be poured. Children resumed games, but attention wandered continually toward Orchard Lane. "Probably nothing at all," declared Colonel Ashcombe, which in village language meant exactly the opposite. Then came the scream. It cut across the lawn so suddenly that every conversation stopped dead. A girl came running from the direction of Orchard Lane, young Elsie Turner from the bakery, white-faced and gasping. "The man," she cried. "There's a man lying there." For one frozen second nobody moved. Then chaos erupted. Chairs overturned. People hurried toward the lane in a dense cluster of alarmed excitement. The vicar attempted unsuccessfully to impose order. Miss Marple rose rather slowly. At her age one learned not to hurry unnecessarily toward horror. Orchard Lane was cool beneath the chestnut trees. Sunlight flickered through the leaves onto the gravel path. A small crowd had already gathered near the hedge bordering the old Carter property. Someone whispered, "Good heavens!" The stranger lay on his back beside the ditch. Even before Dr. Haynes knelt beside him, everyone knew it. There was surprisingly little blood, only a dark stain near the collar and a terrible stillness about the body. The doctor rose after a moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "He's gone." The villagers stared. Death, Miss Marple thought, always seemed unreal at first in peaceful places. People expected tragedy elsewhere, in cities, in newspapers, in foreign countries, not beside familiar hedges under summer trees. "Where's Fenwick?" somebody demanded suddenly. A murmur passed through the crowd, because Gerald Fenwick was nowhere to be seen. Inspector Alan Graves arrived from Much Benham nearly 40 minutes later, broad-shouldered and practical, with the expression of a man already annoyed by complications. He listened briskly to statements. The stranger had been seen speaking to Fenwick. They had walked together into Orchard Lane. No one had seen them return. And now one man was dead while the other had vanished entirely. Inspector Graves asked sharply, "Does anyone know the dead man's name?" Nobody did. But Miss Marple, standing quietly beneath the trees, noticed something peculiar. The dead man's right hand was clenched tightly around a torn scrap of pale blue fabric, not from his own clothing, and not, she thought suddenly, from Gerald Fenwick's. She looked slowly down the lane toward the distant gardens of Rose Hill. Somewhere a dog barked. The summer afternoon had become very still indeed. Rain arrived during the night and settled over Rose Hill by morning in a fine grey mist that softened hedges, blurred rooftops, and deepened the smell of earth and roses. Miss Marple liked rainy days. People became careless in wet weather. They hurried indoors, spoke impulsively, and revealed things unintentionally. Sunshine encouraged performance, rain encouraged truth. She sat beside the window at Rose Cottage with her knitting untouched in her lap, watching droplets gather along the garden fence. At 9:30 there came a brisk knock. It was Inspector Graves again. "You are becoming quite sociable, Inspector," Miss Marple observed pleasantly as he entered. "I'm afraid murder creates bad habits. That has often been my experience." He accepted tea automatically this time, which Miss Marple considered a sign of improvement. "We found Fenwick," he said. Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Alive, I hope?" "Yes, at Paddington Station." Mrs. Simpkins, who was dusting the mantelpiece nearby, gave an audible gasp before instantly pretending not to listen. "He claims he panicked after discovering Lansing dead," the inspector continued. "Says he feared suspicion because of certain past financial dealings." "And were there such dealings?" Inspector Graves removed a notebook. 10 years ago, Fenwick and Lansing worked for the same investment company in London. The firm collapsed after irregularities in several client accounts. "Embezzlement?" asked Miss Marple. "Possibly, though nothing was proved. Fenwick resigned shortly afterward. Lansing disappeared abroad for several years." "How convenient for everyone," murmured Miss Marple. The inspector nodded grimly. "Fenwick admits Lansing threatened him yesterday." "Threatened him how?" "He says Lansing demanded money." "Blackmail, then?" "So it appears." Miss Marple was silent a moment. "And yet," she said softly, "you do not sound convinced." Inspector Graves gave her a long look. "No," he admitted, "I'm not." He leaned back slightly. "Fenwick certainly behaved badly. Running away was idiotic. But I'm not certain he's our killer." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How refreshing. You agree?" "I rarely trust the obvious answer." The inspector hesitated. "There's another matter. We found this in Fenwick's study." He handed her a folded piece of paper. It was a photograph, old, slightly faded. 3 men stood outside what appeared to be a London office building. One was unmistakably a younger Gerald Fenwick. Another matched the dead stranger, Edward Lansing. The third man was unknown to Miss Marple, thin-faced, severe. "What interests me," said Inspector Graves quietly, "is that someone attempted to burn this photograph in the fireplace." Miss Marple studied it carefully. "Recently?" "Very recently." "And Fenwick admits it belongs to him?" "But he denies trying to destroy it." "Exactly." Miss Marple handed the photograph back thoughtfully. Rain tapped softly against the windows. "Do you know," she said at last, "there was once a maid in St. Mary Mead who broke a valuable china shepherdess and immediately blamed the gardener." Inspector Graves blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "She wept beautifully," Miss Marple continued, "far too beautifully. Real distress is usually untidy. Performed distress tends to be organized." The inspector smiled despite himself. "And Fenwick, Mr.? Fear seems genuine. But fear and guilt are not identical." Inspector Graves rose soon afterward. At the door he paused. "Miss Marple, if you notice anything further." "My dear Inspector," she said gently, "at my age one notices almost everything. The difficulty is deciding which things matter." Hawthorne House stood at the edge of the village behind tall yew hedges and iron gates. It was the sort of house built during prosperous Victorian years, large without elegance, solid without charm. Gerald Fenwick had modernized parts of it, though unsuccessfully. The result felt expensive and uncomfortable simultaneously. Miss Marple arrived shortly after luncheon, carrying a basket of early sweet peas from her garden. Flowers, she had long ago discovered, were excellent passports into difficult households. The maid who answered the door looked pale and exhausted. "Yes, miss? I wondered whether Mr. Fenwick's housekeeper might care for some sweet peas. Such dreadful weather always makes one long for flowers indoors." Within moments Miss Marple found herself admitted into the drawing-room, where Mrs. Elkington Fenwick's housekeeper received the flowers with grateful emotion. Mrs. Elkington was a stout woman with anxious eyes and the expression of someone permanently expecting catastrophe. "Everything's been dreadful," she whispered. "Simply dreadful. I can imagine. And the reporters telephoning constantly. Very distressing." Mrs. Elkington lowered her voice further. "I don't believe Mr. Fenwick could kill anybody. Did you know Mr. Lansing?" "No, miss. But you recognize the name?" The housekeeper hesitated. "Only because I heard Mr. Fenwick mention it once." "When was that?" Miss Marple waited patiently. "He seemed upset afterward," Mrs. Elkington admitted finally. "I remember because he knocked over his coffee cup." Interesting, thought Miss Marple. Fear again, not anger. "Did Mr. Fenwick receive many visitors from London?" Very few. But letters? Mrs. Elkington looked uncomfortable. A fair number, miss. Threatening letters? Oh, no. She paused. At least, I don't know. He burned most of his correspondence. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. Regularly? Yes, miss. Every evening, nearly. That was curious. People who systematically destroyed letters generally feared records, either because they were guilty of something or because they feared others were. A sudden movement outside the drawing-room window caught Miss Marple's attention. Diana Harwood was approaching the house through the rain. Mrs. Elkington noticed her too and looked startled. "Does Miss Harwood visit often?" asked Miss Marple mildly. "No, miss." The hesitation after no was extremely eloquent. A moment later Diana entered the room. She stopped abruptly upon seeing Miss Marple. "My dear," said Miss Marple kindly, "what unpleasant weather for walking." Diana looked pale and tense beneath her raincoat. "I came to collect a book Mr. Fenwick lent me." "Of course," said Miss Marple. There followed one of those dreadful silences in which everyone becomes acutely aware that everyone else is concealing something. Mrs. Elkington fled gratefully to fetch the alleged book. Diana avoided Miss Marple's gaze. At last she said abruptly, "You think I'm involved somehow." "My dear child, I think nothing until I have facts." "That means yes." Miss Marple regarded her quietly. "You are frightened," she said. Diana laughed sharply. "A man's been murdered in our village. Everyone's frightened. Not in the same way." For a second Diana's composure cracked. Then she said in a low voice, "You don't understand." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "Perhaps I do not, but people rarely become safer by hiding the truth." Diana turned toward the window where rain streamed down the glass. "He came here yesterday morning," she said suddenly. "Mr. Lansing?" Miss Marple remained very still. "He argued with Gerald," Diana continued. "I heard them from the garden." "What about?" "I couldn't hear clearly." "But—" Diana swallowed. "He said something about the third man." Miss Marple's knitting instincts, as she privately called them, tightened immediately. "The third man? And Mr. Fenwick?" "He told him to keep his voice down." The room seemed quieter suddenly beneath the steady rain. Miss Marple thought of the photograph. 3 men, Fenwick, Lansing, and the unknown third figure. Before she could speak again, Mrs. Elkington returned, carrying a novel. Diana seized it almost desperately. "Thank you," she muttered. Then she hurried from the room. A few seconds later the front door slammed. Mrs. Elkington crossed herself unconsciously. "She's a nice young lady," she whispered, "but I think she's terribly unhappy." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. That, at least, was unquestionably true. Late that evening Inspector Graves received a telephone call from London. After listening silently for nearly a minute, he sat very still at his desk. Then he asked, "Are you absolutely certain?" The voice at the other end replied firmly. When the call ended, the inspector stared out into the rainy darkness beyond the station windows, because the unknown man in the photograph had finally been identified, and according to official records he had died 8 years earlier. The news spread through Rosehill by lunchtime, though naturally nobody admitted knowing how. By 2 o'clock, Mrs. Pritchard had informed at least 11 people that the police were concealing something extraordinarily sinister. By 2:30, Colonel Ashcombe had concluded the matter involved wartime intelligence, and by tea-time several villagers had become entirely convinced that Gerald Fenwick belonged to an international criminal organization. Miss Marple, who knew from long experience that village imagination was both energetic and deeply inaccurate, paid little attention. She was instead occupied with the curious problem of dead men. Inspector Graves arrived at Rose Cottage shortly after 4 o'clock, looking more tired than before. "I suppose," he said as he removed his damp coat, "you've already heard." "That depends," said Miss Marple. "If you mean the theory involving Soviet agents disguised as church wardens, then yes." For the first time in 2 days the inspector laughed outright. "I mean the photograph." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "The third man?" Inspector Graves nodded grimly. "His name was Charles Barrington, former partner in the investment company where Fenwick and Lansing worked, and officially dead. Very officially." The inspector accepted tea wearily. "Barrington supposedly drowned during a fishing holiday in Cornwall 8 years ago. Body recovered. Inquest held. Death certificate issued." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Yet now you are wondering whether he drowned at all." "We're wondering many things." The inspector reached into his case and removed a folded paper. "There's more. Barrington's widow inherited a considerable insurance settlement after his death." "How fortunate." "Yeah, particularly because portions of the missing investment funds vanished permanently at precisely the same period. Miss Marple looked up. Exactly. Rain clouds drifted low beyond the windows. Somewhere nearby a gate banged softly in the wind. It's possible, the inspector continued carefully, that the three men were involved together in financial fraud years ago. Barrington disappears conveniently. Lansing returns suddenly. Fenwick panics, and someone dies. Miss Marple was silent for a moment. Then she said quietly, "If Charles Barrington is alive, why reveal himself now?" Inspector Graves frowned. "What do you mean?" "Human beings rarely abandon successful deceptions voluntarily. If a man has remained legally dead for 8 years, something must have changed." The inspector considered that. "You think Lansing found him?" "Possibly. Or Fenwick. Perhaps." Miss Marple folded her hands. "But there is another possibility."
"What's that?"
"That Charles Barrington truly is dead." The inspector blinked. "But the photograph—" "My dear inspector, photographs merely prove that someone once stood beside someone else. They do not prove what happened afterward." Inspector Graves looked faintly frustrated. "You always make things more complicated." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "People make things complicated. I merely notice." That evening Rose Hill hosted one of its least successful dinner parties. The Lambert household had invited several guests weeks earlier before murder disrupted village life, and Mrs. Lambert believed strongly that social obligations must continue regardless of homicide. As a result, 8 uncomfortable people assembled around a beautifully polished dining table while trying unsuccessfully not to discuss death. Miss Marple, seated beside the vicar, observed everyone carefully. Hugh Lambert looked exhausted. Diana Harwood, wearing pale blue silk, appeared strained almost to breaking point. Gerald Fenwick's empty chair stood like an accusation. And at the far end of the table sat Mrs. Clara Barrington. She had arrived unexpectedly from London that afternoon after police contacted her regarding her late husband. Miss Marple studied her with interest. Clara Barrington was perhaps 50, elegant in a severe fashion, with smooth dark hair and remarkably controlled features. She spoke little and watched everything. A woman accustomed to restraint. Those were often dangerous women. "You knew Mr. Fenwick well?" the vicar asked politely. Mrs. Barrington's fork paused almost invisibly. "My husband knew him better than I did, but they were business partners." Her voice remained calm. Too calm, Miss Marple thought suddenly. Most widows reacted emotionally when discussing husbands who might not actually be dead after 8 years. Clara Barrington sounded merely careful. Mrs. Lambert, determined to rescue conversation, said brightly, "Surely there must be some mistake. One cannot simply stop being dead." "No," said Mrs. Barrington quietly. "One cannot." The remark produced a curious silence. Miss Marple noticed Diana glance sharply toward Mrs. Barrington. Fear again. Fear was becoming altogether too common in Rose Hill. Dinner continued awkwardly. The soup went cold while Colonel Ashcombe launched into theories about forged identities. Mrs. Lambert attempted unsuccessfully to discuss roses. Hugh drank more wine than usual, and through it all Clara Barrington remained composed. At last, as coffee was served in the drawing-room, Miss Marple found herself briefly alone beside her. "You must have had a distressing journey," Miss Marple said kindly. "I've endured worse." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "I imagine you have." Mrs. Barrington looked at her directly then. Her eyes were intelligent and unexpectedly hard. "You are observing me, Miss Marple." "My dear Mrs. Barrington, elderly ladies observe everyone. It is our principal recreation." For the faintest instant something almost like amusement touched the other woman's mouth. "People underestimate you." "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple.
"Constantly."
Mrs. Barrington glanced toward the others across the room. "They think Charles may still be alive. And what do you think?" The pause lasted only a moment too long. "I buried my husband," she said. "Not Charles is dead. Not it's impossible. Merely, I buried my husband." A very careful distinction. Before Miss Marple could pursue the thought further, Diana Harwood crossed the room abruptly. "Mrs. Barrington," she said tensely, "may I speak with you privately?" Every instinct in Miss Marple sharpened instantly. Clara Barrington rose smoothly. "Certainly." The two women disappeared into the conservatory beyond the drawing-room. Miss Marple resumed knitting quietly. 5 minutes later Hugh Lambert approached her. "You think Diana's hiding something." "It was not a question, my dear boy," said Miss Marple gently. "When young people fall in love, they often begin hiding things almost immediately. It is one of the great weaknesses of romance. Hugh gave a tired smile. She's frightened.
Of what?
Miss Marple looked toward the conservatory doors. That, she said softly, is precisely the important question. The conservatory smelled faintly of damp earth and lemon blossoms. Rain tapped softly against the glass roof overhead. Clara Barrington stood beside the fern table watching Diana calmly. "Well?" she asked. Diana's hands trembled visibly. "You shouldn't have come here." "Really? You know what this means?" "Yes," said Mrs. Barrington. "I imagine I do." Diana swallowed hard. "If they discover the truth." "The truth," interrupted Clara quietly, "is usually discovered eventually. You promised." "No," said Clara Barrington. "Your mistake, my dear, was believing promises mattered." Diana stared at her in horror. Then Mrs. Barrington stepped closer and spoke very softly. "Tell me something. Before Edward Lansing died, did he speak to anyone else?" Diana hesitated, and that hesitation answered enough. Clara Barrington's eyes hardened.
"I see."
At that exact moment, somewhere outside in the darkness beyond the conservatory windows, a figure moved silently through the rain, watching, listening, and holding, concealed beneath a dark coat, a revolver. Miss Marple slept lightly. It was an advantage she had discovered years earlier during an unfortunate episode involving a kleptomaniac house-guest in St. Mary Mead and a missing silver mustard spoon. Elderly ladies, people assumed, either slept constantly or not at all. In truth, they often existed in a peculiar middle state of awareness. Thus it was that shortly after midnight, hearing hurried footsteps outside on the wet pavement, Miss Marple opened her eyes immediately. A moment later came the sound of the front gate, then knocking. Uneven. Miss Marple lit the bedside lamp and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders before opening the door. Diana Harwood stood on the step, drenched by rain and trembling violently. "My dear child," exclaimed Miss Marple, "come inside at once." Diana entered almost blindly. Her face was white beneath wet strands of dark hair, and her gloves were spotted with mud. Miss Marple guided her gently into the sitting-room and poured a small measure of sherry without comment. For several moments Diana could not speak. Then she whispered, "I think someone's trying to kill me." The rain beat steadily against the cottage windows. Miss Marple sat opposite her quietly. "Tell me exactly what happened." Diana swallowed hard. "After dinner tonight, after speaking to Mrs. Barrington, I walked home through the church path." "Yes? I heard footsteps behind me. Did you see anyone?" "Numero. But when I reached the lane near my cottage, she stopped, visibly struggling. Someone fired a gun." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened instantly. "The shot missed?" Diana nodded shakily. "It struck the wall beside me. And then?"
"I ran."
"Did you hear pursuit?"
"No."
Miss Marple considered. A frightened imagination could easily transform shadows into murder. But Diana's terror seemed genuine and specific, not hysteria. "Did you inform the police?" "No." Diana looked suddenly ashamed. "I came here first." "My dear," said Miss Marple kindly, "that was probably wise, because frightened people often revealed more before policemen arrived." Miss Marple handed her a dry blanket. "Now," she said gently, "what frightened you at dinner?" Diana stared into the fire. For a long moment Miss Marple thought she would refuse. Then the words came abruptly. "I knew Edward Lansing." Miss Marple said nothing. "He came to Rosehill because of me." Outside, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. Diana twisted the blanket tightly in her hands. "Years ago, before I came here, I worked briefly in London. I was secretary to Charles Barrington." Miss Marple's knitting instincts tightened immediately.
"I see."
"I was very young," Diana whispered, "and foolish. Mr. Barrington was kind to me after my father died. He helped arrange my position. Later, I discovered things." "What sort of things?" Diana looked up helplessly. "Money disappearing. Documents altered. Men lying constantly." Her voice dropped. "I think they were stealing from clients. Barrington, Fenwick, and Lansing." Miss Marple remained perfectly still. "And what happened then?" "One day Mr. Barrington vanished. The supposed drowning." Diana nodded. "Afterward everything became terrible. There were investigations. Mr. Fenwick warned me never to discuss anything I'd seen. And Mr. Lansing? He disappeared abroad." Miss Marple folded her hands thoughtfully. "Yet Mr. Lansing came back." "Why?" Diana hesitated. Then she said very softly, "Because someone was blackmailing someone." Miss Marple watched her carefully. "But you don't know who?" "No." That, Miss Marple thought, was probably true. A sudden knock interrupted them both. Official. Inspector Graves entered moments later, raincoat glistening with water. His expression changed sharply upon seeing Diana. "So you are here." Diana stood abruptly. "I was just leaving." "No," said the inspector quietly. "I think perhaps you're not?" 20 minutes later the three of them sat together in Miss Marple's sitting-room while the storm worsened outside. Inspector Graves listened in silence as Diana repeated her story. When she finished, he leaned back slowly. "You should have told us this earlier. I was afraid." "Of Fenwick?" "No." Diana looked down. "Of Mrs. Barrington." The inspector frowned. "Why?" Diana hesitated. "Because she knew." "Knew what?" "That Charles Barrington never drowned." The room became very still. Miss Marple watched the inspector carefully. "What evidence have you for that?" he asked. "I overheard them arguing once in London," Diana said. "Barrington told Fenwick the insurance money would keep Clara comfortable for life." Inspector Graves exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. Missing funds, a staged death. It fitted altogether too neatly. Yet something still troubled Miss Marple profoundly. "Did you ever meet Charles Barrington after his supposed death?" she asked quietly. Diana stared. "No!" The answer came instantly. Too instantly, perhaps. Miss Marple noticed Inspector Graves thinking the same thing. Before either could speak further, the telephone rang sharply in the hall. Miss Marple rose to answer it. A few moments later she returned slowly. "There has been another incident," she said. Inspector Graves stood immediately. "What sort of incident?" "At Hawthorne House." Her expression had altered very slightly. "Mrs. Elkington discovered someone searching Gerald Fenwick's study." "Who?" "She doesn't know. The intruder escaped through the garden." Inspector Graves was already reaching for his coat. "Did they take anything?" Miss Marple looked at him carefully. "That," she said softly, "is apparently the curious part. Nothing had been stolen. But the entire study had been torn apart as though someone were desperately searching for one particular thing. The rain had nearly stopped by the time they reached Hawthorne House. Police lanterns moved through the wet darkness outside like drifting yellow ghosts. Inside, Mrs. Elkington sat pale and shaking in the drawing-room while a constable took notes. "It was horrible," she whispered. "I heard drawers banging upstairs." Inspector Graves moved quickly toward the study. Miss Marple followed more slowly. The room was in chaos. Papers littered the carpet. Desk drawers hung open. Books had been pulled from shelves and scattered carelessly. Not ordinary theft, desperation. Miss Marple moved quietly around the room. Then she noticed something. One section of the bookshelf remained untouched, a narrow row near the fireplace. Everything else had been disturbed violently except for 6 books standing perfectly aligned. Too perfectly. "Inspector," she said softly. Graves crossed over immediately. Miss Marple touched the spine of one volume gently. "The intruder searched everywhere except here." The inspector frowned. "Meaning?" "My dear Inspector," said Miss Marple, "when human beings avoid looking somewhere obvious, it usually means they already know what is there." Inspector Graves pulled the books aside. Behind them, concealed within the shelf paneling, was a small hidden compartment, empty, but recently emptied. The inspector swore under his breath. Miss Marple stared thoughtfully at the vacant space. Someone had hidden something in Gerald Fenwick's study, something important enough to kill for, and someone else had now taken it. At that exact moment, from somewhere outside in the darkness beyond the rain-soaked gardens, came the sound of footsteps running rapidly away. Inspector Graves reached the garden door almost instantly. By the time the constable circled the hedges with his lantern, however, the intruder had vanished into the darkness beyond Hawthorne House. Only muddy footprints remained near the side gate. "Damn!" muttered Graves. Miss Marple stood quietly beside the ruined study, observing the rainwater glistening on the stone terrace outside. "Men often run when frightened," she remarked gently. The inspector looked over his shoulder. "You think our visitor was frightened?" "My dear Inspector, people searching calmly do not overturn entire rooms. Panic makes human beings careless." Graves crouched near the hidden compartment. Whatever was here mattered. "But Fenwick claims he knows nothing about it." Miss Marple's expression remained mild. "People do occasionally tell lies." The inspector gave her a dry look. "So I've heard." Mrs. Elkington appeared shakily in the doorway. "There's someone asking for you, Inspector." "Who?" "A journalist, I think." Inspector Graves groaned softly. Miss Marple sympathized. Reporters descended upon murder with the cheerful persistence of gulls around fishing boats. "I'll join you shortly," the inspector said. When he had gone, Miss Marple remained alone in the study for several moments. Her eyes wandered slowly across the disorder. A smashed ink bottle near the desk, papers soaked dark blue, a torn envelope on the carpet, and there half hidden beneath a chair leg a tiny fragment of pale blue silk. Miss Marple bent carefully and picked it up. Very soft, very fine quality, and remarkably familiar. She slipped it silently into her handbag just as Mrs. Elkington returned. "Such wickedness," the housekeeper whispered. "I never imagined things like this could happen in Rose Hill." "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple absently. "They can happen anywhere." Because evil, she reflected, was never modern or fashionable or dramatic in the way people preferred to imagine. Usually it was small and frightened and greedy, like a fox stealing hens, or a trusted bookkeeper stealing pensions. The following morning dawned clear and painfully bright after the storm. Rose Hill looked scrubbed and innocent beneath the early sunshine. Roses climbed over cottage walls. Sparrows argued noisily in hedges. Milk carts rattled peacefully along the lane. The village appeared entirely incapable of murder, which, Miss Marple thought, was precisely why murder succeeded so often there. She was trimming sweet peas in her garden when Diana Harwood appeared at the gate. The girl looked exhausted. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, my dear." Diana hesitated. "I wanted to apologize for last night." "There's no need. I behaved foolishly." Miss Marple laid aside her gardening scissors. "My dear child, frightened people are rarely foolish. Merely frightened." Diana gave a strained smile. "You always make everything sound simpler." "Oh, no," said Miss Marple. "Human beings are never simple." They sat together beneath the apple tree while Miss Marple poured coffee. For a while neither spoke. Then Miss Marple said quietly, "You worked for Charles Barrington for nearly a year, I think." Diana looked startled. "You admired him once." Another hesitation. "He was charming." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "That is often the beginning of trouble." Diana stared down into her cup. "I didn't know what they were doing at first, but eventually you understood." "Yes. And Mr. Fenwick?" Diana's expression changed subtly. Fear again. Not affection. Not grief. "He frightened me," she admitted at last. Miss Marple nodded. "Because he was ruthless?" Gerald Fenwick certainly possessed secrets, but ruthlessness and fear were not quite the same thing. "You were wearing blue silk at dinner 2 nights ago," Miss Marple said suddenly. Diana looked up sharply. "Yes." "Very pretty." The girl relaxed slightly. "My aunt sent it from London." Miss Marple smiled gently. Then she withdrew the small fragment of silk from her handbag. "I found this in Mr. Fenwick's study." Diana went completely white. For one terrible second she looked like someone about to faint. Then she whispered, "I can explain." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "I think perhaps you should." It emerged in fragments. Diana had gone to Hawthorne House the previous evening after dinner. Not to steal. "For what?" asked Miss Marple. "A ledger." The word fell heavily between them. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened immediately. "A financial ledger?" Diana twisted her hands tightly together. "Edward Lansing told me about it before he died. He said Gerald kept records of everything. Payments." Her voice dropped. "Proof of the fraud, and of what happened afterward." Miss Marple sat very still. What did Lansing intend to do with this information? "I don't know." But she avoided Miss Marple's eyes. That generally meant she knew rather more than she wished to say. "And you searched Fenwick's study last night. Did you find the ledger?" "No." Miss Marple believed her, because genuine disappointment still lingered visibly beneath Diana's fear. "Then someone reached it before you?" Diana nodded miserably. "I think so." There was silence for a moment beneath the soft rustling of leaves overhead. Then Miss Marple asked the important question. "Why are you truly afraid of Clara Barrington?" Diana's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. At last she whispered, "Because she knows Charles is alive." Miss Marple did not move. "That is a serious statement." "It's true." "How do you know?" Diana swallowed. "Because I saw him." The garden seemed suddenly very quiet. Miss Marple spoke carefully.
"When?"
3 months ago. In London.
"Where?"
"At Victoria Station." "And you are certain?" "What happened?" "He saw me." Diana's voice trembled. "And afterwards someone followed me home." Miss Marple's thoughts moved rapidly now. If Charles Barrington lived, then the staged death was real, which meant conspiracy, blackmail, and possibly multiple murderers. Yet one thing still refused to fit neatly. "Why come back now?" she murmured aloud. Diana looked confused. If Barrington successfully disappeared years ago, why risk exposure? "I don't know." Number. Neither of them did. A shadow crossed the garden path. Inspector Graves stood at the gate. His expression told Miss Marple immediately that something new had happened. "Miss Harwood," he said gravely, "I'm afraid I must ask you to come with me." Diana rose slowly. "What is it?" The inspector hesitated. Then he said, "We found Gerald Fenwick." For one brief instant relief flashed across Diana's face, until the inspector added quietly, "He was dead when we found him." The old quarry beyond Rosehill Common had not been used in nearly 20 years. Children occasionally wandered there in summer despite strict instructions not to do so. Lovers met there discreetly in the evenings. Once, according to Colonel Ashcombe, smugglers had hidden contraband whiskey among the abandoned stone sheds during the war. Though Miss Marple privately suspected the colonel improved his stories with each telling. It was there, shortly after dawn, that Gerald Fenwick's body had been discovered. Miss Marple accompanied Inspector Graves reluctantly. She disliked violent death intensely. Contrary to popular belief, familiarity with murder did not make one enjoy corpses. The quarry lay bleak and silent beneath a pale morning sky. Wet grass bent beneath the wind. Policemen moved quietly near the lower stone ledge, where the body rested. Gerald Fenwick had been shot once through the chest. Very neat, very deliberate. Miss Marple stood a little apart while Inspector Graves spoke with the doctor. No signs of struggle. Death sometime during the night. A revolver fired at close range. The inspector returned after several minutes, looking grim. "This changes matters considerably." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "It usually does." Inspector Graves glanced toward Diana Harwood, who sat nearby beneath a constable's watch, pale with shock. "She claims she hasn't seen Fenwick since the fete. And do you believe her?" "I don't know." Miss Marple looked toward the dead man. Gerald Fenwick no longer appeared smooth or charming or faintly dangerous. Death had removed all personality, leaving only a heavy middle-aged body lying awkwardly on cold stone. Human beings vanished so quickly, she thought, yet their wickedness lingered behind them. "Was anything found on him?" she asked. The inspector handed her a small evidence envelope. Inside lay a folded railway receipt, several banknotes, and a key. Miss Marple examined the key carefully. Small brass, unmarked. "Curious," she murmured. "You recognize it?" "Numero. But men fleeing villages after murder generally travel lighter than this." She looked up thoughtfully. "Did Fenwick intend to leave England?" "We don't know. But he was carrying money." Miss Marple handed back the envelope. "People run away for different reasons, Inspector. Some because they are guilty, others because they are terrified." The inspector sighed. "And sometimes both." "Yes," admitted Miss Marple. "Sometimes both." By afternoon the village had descended into near hysteria. A second murder transformed gossip into fear. Doors were locked earlier than usual. Curtains twitched constantly. Groups formed in lowered conversation outside shops and church gates, because now everyone understood something dreadful. A killer was still in Rosehill. Mrs. Pritchard declared firmly that no respectable person ought to leave home after sunset. Colonel Ashcombe organized what he called night patrols, consisting largely of wandering about with a torch and alarming innocent pedestrians. Meanwhile, the Blue Boar Inn did unprecedented business. Miss Marple, returning from the quarry, found Dolly Bantry waiting anxiously in her sitting-room. "My dear Jane, this is becoming terrible." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I'm afraid it is. Do they suspect Diana?" "Almost certainly." Dolly lowered her voice dramatically. "And do you?" Miss Marple removed her gloves slowly. "No." Dolly blinked, but she lied repeatedly. She searched Fenwick's house. She knew all those dreadful men. Miss Marple folded the gloves neatly into her lap. "My dear Dolly, frightened women often behave foolishly. Murderers generally behave logically." Dolly looked unconvinced. "But what about the shooting last night?" "Interesting," said Miss Marple softly. "Interesting?" "Yeah." "Because whoever fired at Diana apparently missed." "Well, naturally one can miss." "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple. "But not usually at close range in narrow lanes during complete silence." Dolly stared. "You think it wasn't meant to kill her?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked to the window overlooking the garden. Roses moved gently in the afternoon breeze. Beyond them lay the peaceful village of Rose Hill, with its lace curtains and tidy hedges and hidden corruption. At last she said quietly, "I think someone wished Diana frightened." That evening Inspector Graves requested Miss Marple's presence at the station. He looked exhausted when she arrived. "There's been another development." "Yes?" He handed her a document. It was a bank statement. Several large payments had been made over the last 2 years from one of Gerald Fenwick's accounts. Regular monthly amounts, always to the same recipient, C. Barrington. Miss Marple looked up slowly. So Charles Barrington was alive. It appears so. And blackmailing Fenwick, perhaps. Likely. The inspector rubbed his forehead tiredly. "We also traced the key found on Fenwick's body. And it belongs to a luggage locker at Paddington Station." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened immediately. "Have you opened it?" "Not yet. I was waiting for authorization." "Inspector," said Miss Marple gently, "human beings who hide important things in railway lockers rarely improve matters by waiting." He almost smiled. "I thought you'd say that." Paddington Station smelled of steam, rain, and damp newspapers. Miss Marple disliked London stations intensely. They contained too many hurried people and too little courtesy. Inspector Graves unlocked the luggage compartment while a railway official hovered nearby importantly. Inside lay a single battered leather case. The inspector lifted it carefully onto a bench and opened it. For a moment nobody spoke. The case contained documents, dozens of them, bank ledgers, account books, and on top of everything else lay a revolver. Inspector Graves exhaled slowly. "Well." Miss Marple picked up one of the ledgers carefully. Names filled the pages in precise handwriting beside columns of figures. Investment accounts, withdrawals, false transfers, years of systematic fraud. She turned another page. Payments to Charles Barrington after his supposed death. Payments from Fenwick to Edward Lansing. And then more recently large withdrawals marked only with initials. D.H. Miss Marple felt the inspector watching her. "Diana Harwood," he said quietly. They stood in silence. At last Inspector Graves said grimly, "This is enough to arrest her." Miss Marple closed the ledger slowly. "No," she said. The inspector stared. "No?" "My dear Inspector, this is enough to frame her." Before he could answer, Miss Marple lifted one final item from the suitcase. A photograph, newer than the earlier one. It showed Charles Barrington alive and unmistakable, seated outside a café somewhere abroad. And beside him sat Clara Barrington, not mourning widow and missing husband, partners. Inspector Graves swore softly under his breath. Miss Marple continued staring at the photograph. Something about it troubled her deeply. Then suddenly she realized what it was. The date stamped faintly on the café awning behind them. 18 months ago, which meant Charles Barrington had been alive recently. Very recently. Yet Gerald Fenwick was now dead. Edward Lansing was dead, and someone had desperately wanted Diana Harwood blamed for everything. Miss Marple looked slowly up at Inspector Graves. "We are missing something important." "What?" She thought for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "I do not think Charles Barrington was the cleverest person involved." The journey back from London passed mostly in silence. Inspector Graves sat opposite Miss Marple in the railway carriage, the leather case of documents secured beside him like a dangerous animal. Outside the windows, evening settled slowly across the countryside. Fields darkened beneath low clouds. Villages drifted past in brief clusters of yellow lamplight. At last the inspector said, "You believe Clara Barrington is more involved than she admits?"
Yes.
"Because of the photograph?" "Partly." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly over her umbrella. "My dear Inspector, there is something rather unnatural about widows." He blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Not ordinary widows, of course, only deceptive ones. A genuinely bereaved woman develops habits of memory. She speaks unconsciously of the dead person's preferences, small domestic things." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Mrs. Barrington never once referred to her husband as though she had lived beside him." Inspector Graves considered that. She always spoke carefully. "Exactly, and Diana feared her." The train rattled onward through the darkness. At last the inspector said slowly, "You think Clara Barrington controlled the others?" Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "No," she said softly. "I think she understood them." Rose Hill had become unnaturally quiet by the time they returned. Fear altered villages in curious ways. Doors closed earlier. Conversation shortened, even gossip grew cautious. Miss Marple noticed curtains move as she walked home from the station. Everyone was watching everyone else now. That was dangerous, because frightened communities often preferred convenient guilt to difficult truth. At Rose Cottage she found a note waiting beneath the door. It contained only 3 words: "Stop asking questions." No signature, no explanation, merely those words written in sharp black ink. Miss Marple read it calmly. Then she placed it beside the mantel clock and prepared herself a cup of tea. Threats, she reflected, were generally encouraging. They suggested progress. The following morning brought another shock. Clara Barrington had disappeared. Inspector Graves arrived before breakfast, visibly furious. She left the inn sometime during the night. Did she take luggage? Only a handbag. Miss Marple looked up sharply. Only a handbag? That is interesting. The inspector frowned. How? My dear Inspector, women intending permanent flight take far more inconvenient objects. He stared at her. Hats, explained Miss Marple patiently. Toilet articles. Extra shoes. People may flee murder investigations without hesitation, but they rarely abandon cold cream voluntarily. To his credit, Inspector Graves did not laugh. You think she intends to return? Possibly. Or she left in a hurry. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. Did she receive visitors yesterday? Who? Hugh Lambert. That surprised her. Why? He claimed she requested legal advice. About what? She wouldn't say. Miss Marple sat very still. Legal advice. What sort of advice does Hugh specialize in? Property matters mostly. Property. Inheritance. Suddenly Miss Marple thought of something else entirely. When Charles Barrington died, she said slowly, his estate passed entirely to his wife. And if he were discovered alive? Inspector Graves stared at her. The insurance settlement would become fraud. And the marriage? The inspector's expression changed. Legally complicated. Quite. Miss Marple leaned back thoughtfully. If Charles wished to return openly after 8 years, Clara Barrington stood to lose everything. Silence filled the little sitting-room. At last Inspector Graves said quietly, You think she killed him? No, said Miss Marple softly. I think she may have needed him dead. That afternoon Diana Harwood came again to Rose Cottage. She looked exhausted from lack of sleep. They think I murdered Gerald. Some people do. And you? Miss Marple smiled gently. My dear child, if you had murdered Gerald Fenwick, you would not look guilty. You would look determined. Diana stared despite herself. That's rather frightening. It is merely experience. Miss Marple gestured toward the chair beside the fire. Sit down. There are things I wish to ask you. Diana obeyed nervously. You told me Charles Barrington followed you after you saw him in London. Did he speak to you? No. But someone did eventually. Diana's face changed instantly. Real fear. Miss Marple waited quietly. At last Diana whispered, Clara Barrington came to see me. She told me I had imagined things. And did you believe her? No. What else did she say? Diana hesitated. She said some people were safer left dead. The room seemed colder suddenly. Miss Marple looked down at her knitting. A curious thing about dangerous people, she reflected, was how often they revealed themselves indirectly. Not through dramatic confession, but through small remarks that exposed their moral thinking. Safer left dead. That sounded very like Clara Barrington. Did she threaten you? Miss Marple asked quietly. How? She said if I spoke about seeing Charles, everyone would believe I was involved in the old fraud. Miss Marple nodded slowly. A sensible threat, and effective. You never received money from Fenwick, did you? Diana looked startled. No. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I didn't think so. Then why were my initials in the ledger? Probably because someone wished them there. At that moment the front gate clicked sharply outside. Miss Marple glanced through the lace curtains. A tall figure was approaching the cottage, Hugh Lambert. But something about him seemed wrong. He looked pale. And when he entered the sitting-room moments later, Miss Marple saw immediately that he was badly frightened. Hugh, said Diana, what's happened? He closed the door carefully behind him. Then he said in a low voice, I know where Clara Barrington went. Inspector Graves arrived less than 15 minutes later. By then Hugh Lambert had recovered enough composure to explain. She came to see me yesterday evening, he said. She wanted advice about changing a will. A will, repeated Graves sharply. Whose will? Her own. The inspector exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. Go on. Hugh swallowed. She said if anything happened to her, certain papers were to be delivered to the police. What papers? She didn't say. Miss Marple spoke quietly. But she mentioned where she was going. Yes. Hugh looked miserable. At the time it meant nothing to me. And now? Hugh hesitated. Then he whispered. She said she was finally going to meet her husband. The inspector's face hardened instantly. Where? Hugh looked toward Miss Marple almost helplessly. At the old coast house near Whitcomb Bay. Miss Marple's knitting slipped gently from her lap, because suddenly everything rearranged itself in her mind. The blackmail, the disappearances, the fear, the desperate search for the ledger, and Clara Barrington fleeing Rose Hill without luggage, not running away, going toward something, or someone. Miss Marple rose slowly. "My dear Inspector," she said softly, "I think we must go to Whitcomb Bay immediately." And somewhere far beyond Rose Hill, near the lonely grey coastline where old secrets had first begun, someone was waiting in a house beside the sea. Whitcomb Bay lay nearly 30 miles from Rose Hill, where the coastline turned harsh and rocky beneath towering grey cliffs. It was not a cheerful place. Even in summer the sea there seemed cold and unfriendly, pounding endlessly against black stone. Salt wind bent the grass flat along the cliff paths, and the few scattered cottages appeared permanently weather-beaten. Miss Marple disliked it immediately. "Perfect place for smuggling," remarked Colonel Ashcombe once during a holiday many years before. Miss Marple had thought then and still thought now that it was a perfect place for secrets. The coast house stood alone beyond the village, overlooking the water from a narrow rise. It had once belonged to a fisherman's family, though now its windows were shuttered and the garden untended. Inspector Graves stopped the motor-car beside the gate. No lights showed inside. The wind carried the smell of rain and salt. "You stay here," the inspector said automatically. Miss Marple gave him a look of such profound disapproval that he altered course at once. Or perhaps not. "Thank you," said Miss Marple calmly. A constable forced the front door. The house beyond smelled of damp wood and stale cigarette smoke. Someone had been living there recently. A kettle stood near the stove. Newspapers lay folded on the table. Men's clothing hung beside the hearth, and on the mantelpiece sat a framed photograph of Clara Barrington, not hidden. Inspector Graves moved quietly through the downstairs rooms while the constable checked above. Miss Marple remained near the sitting-room doorway, observing details. 2 cups on the table, one recently used, ash still warm in the fireplace, and near the window a walking stick, not decorative, necessary. She bent carefully toward it. The rubber tip was heavily worn on one side. Very often, she reflected, people imagined criminal masterminds as vigorous and imposing. Yet weakness shaped human behavior far more frequently than strength. Footsteps sounded overhead. Then the constable called sharply, "Inspector!" They found Clara Barrington upstairs. She sat in a chair near the bedroom window, perfectly composed despite the pistol resting in her lap. For one extraordinary moment nobody moved. The sea crashed below the cliffs outside. Inspector Graves spoke first. "Mrs. Barrington." She looked at him calmly. "You're rather later than I expected." The pistol remained pointed toward the floor, not defensive, not frightened, simply waiting. Miss Marple watched her carefully. People about to commit suicide usually displayed emotional exhaustion. Clara Barrington did not. She looked alert, almost relieved. "Where is your husband?" asked Graves. Something flickered briefly across Clara's face. "Dead," she said. The word fell heavily into the room. "When?" asked the inspector. 8 years ago." Silence followed. Then Miss Marple said quietly, "No." Clara Barrington turned her head slowly. Their eyes met, and for the first time since this affair began, Miss Marple saw genuine uncertainty in the other woman's expression. "My dear Mrs. Barrington," she said gently, "you are very intelligent, but you have made one mistake." The room seemed to tighten around them. "What mistake?" Clara asked softly. "You assumed everyone else would misunderstand motive." Inspector Graves glanced sharply between them. Miss Marple stepped forward a little. "You did not flee Rose Hill because you feared arrest. You fled because someone else came here tonight." Clara said nothing. "But that person has already gone." Still silence. Then Miss Marple looked toward the half-open wardrobe beside the bed. "Inspector," she said quietly, "there is someone else in this house." Everything happened very quickly afterward. Graves crossed the room sharply. The wardrobe door burst open. A man lunged out violently, striking the inspector aside. The constable shouted. The pistol fired once deafeningly into the ceiling. Then the stranger stumbled toward the stairs, and Miss Marple saw his face clearly. Older, grey-haired now, but unmistakable. Charles Barrington. He was caught before reaching the front door. Age and panic had slowed him badly. Within minutes he sat handcuffed in the downstairs sitting-room, breathing heavily while Inspector Graves questioned him. Clara Barrington descended slowly afterward and seated herself opposite her husband. Neither looked at the other. It was suddenly apparent to Miss Marple that whatever bound them together was no longer affection. Perhaps it never had been. "You faked your death," said Inspector Graves flatly. Charles gave a tired laugh. "Why? Money?" At least, Miss Marple thought, there was honesty in that. Barrington wiped trembling hands together. The company was collapsing. Clients wanted withdrawals. Fenwick panicked. His eyes flickered toward Clara briefly. "My wife suggested disappearing." Inspector Graves stared. "She planned it?" Clara smiled faintly. "My husband lacked imagination." Charles looked away bitterly. "The insurance money solved everything at first. We divided the stolen funds. Lansing went abroad. Fenwick remained in England. And you?" "I stayed hidden. Until recently." Charles nodded miserably. "Lansing found me 6 months ago." "Blackmail?" "How?" "He threatened exposure unless we paid him." Miss Marple sat quietly listening. Everything fitted now. Almost everything. "Then why kill him?" asked Graves. Charles looked genuinely startled. "I didn't." Inspector Graves' expression hardened. "Don't waste my time." "It's true." Barrington's voice cracked suddenly. "I never went to Rose Hill until yesterday." Miss Marple believed him instantly. Not because he seemed honest, he clearly was not, but because his fear carried the confused desperation of weaker men. Charles Barrington was not the sort who committed cold murder twice successfully. He was the sort who followed stronger personalities, like Clara. Inspector Graves turned toward her. "And you, Mrs. Barrington?" She remained perfectly calm. "I also did not kill Edward Lansing, but you knew he was blackmailing your husband." "And Gerald Fenwick?" A pause. "No." Miss Marple watched her carefully. Still controlled, still precise. Marple watched her carefully. Still controlled, still precise, yet there was strain beneath it now, like glass under pressure. Then suddenly Miss Marple asked, "When did you last see Gerald Fenwick alive?" Clara looked directly at her. "The night before he died." Inspector Graves straightened sharply. "You lied about that." "Why?" "Because Gerald was frightened." Her voice remained cool. "He believed someone intended to kill him." The room became silent. Miss Marple spoke softly. "Did he say who?" At last, for the first time, Clara Barrington hesitated visibly. And that hesitation told Miss Marple more than the answer itself. "He thought," Clara said slowly, "that Diana Harwood knew where the ledger was." Diana. Again Diana. Too convenient. Far too convenient. Miss Marple folded her hands gently. And suddenly, like a curtain lifting, she saw the truth at last. Not every detail, but enough. Enough to understand who had truly been afraid from the beginning. And enough to understand why Gerald Fenwick had run. Because Gerald had not feared exposure. He had feared someone much closer to him than Charles Barrington. Miss Marple looked quietly toward the dark sea beyond the windows. Then she said, "My dear Inspector, I think we must return to Rose Hill at once." The journey back to Rose Hill began shortly after midnight. Charles Barrington, exhausted and defeated, sat between two constables in silence. Clara Barrington rode separately with Inspector Graves, composed once more behind her pale stillness. Only Miss Marple remained awake throughout the drive. The countryside slipped past beneath moonlight and drifting clouds. Hedges cast long shadows across empty roads. Occasionally an owl swept low across the fields like a silent thought. Miss Marple's mind moved steadily through the facts. Not the dramatic fact shootings, blackmail, disappearances. Those often distracted people from truth. No, it was the smaller matters that troubled her. The missed shot fired at Diana Harwood, the planted evidence, the panic at Hawthorne House, and above all Gerald Fenwick's fear. Fear of Diana. Fear for Diana, perhaps. Miss Marple folded her hands quietly in the darkness. Human beings were forever misreading emotion. Rose Hill slept uneasily beneath the early morning mist when they arrived. Inspector Graves escorted the Barringtons directly to the station, while Miss Marple returned home for a few hours' rest. At 10 o'clock precisely she sent notes to 4 people, one to Diana Harwood, one to Hugh Lambert, one to Miss Ice Pritchard because information spread more efficiently through Miss Ice Pritchard than through the postal service. and one to Inspector Graves. By noon the inspector arrived looking suspicious already. "You've arranged something." "Yes," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I dislike that tone." "So do murderers," she observed. He sighed heavily. "What have you discovered?" Miss Marple was arranging sandwiches on a tray. "My dear Inspector, there is something rather curious about murder. That being, people imagine it requires courage. Usually it requires the opposite." He stared. "Cowardice?" Miss Marple poured tea carefully. "Most murderers kill because they are cornered, frightened, desperate to preserve something." Inspector Graves sat down slowly. "You know who killed Lansing and Fenwick?" "Yes." Miss Marple handed him a cup. "I should prefer everyone present together." The inspector groaned softly. "You've planned a drawing-room revelation." "My dear man," said Miss Marple, mildly shocked, "one must be orderly." They assembled at 4 o'clock in the drawing-room of Rose Cottage. Diana Harwood sat pale beside Hugh Lambert. Mrs. Pritchard arrived vibrating visibly with anticipation. Colonel Ashcombe attended uninvited. Clara Barrington came under police supervision, elegant and unreadable. Charles Barrington looked broken entirely, and Inspector Graves stood beside the fireplace with folded arms. Miss Marple herself sat quietly near the window with her knitting. For several moments no one spoke. Then Colonel Ashcombe cleared his throat importantly. "I presume we are here because the killer has been identified." "In a sense," said Miss Marple. Mrs. Pritchard nearly leaned off her chair. Miss Marple looked first toward Charles Barrington. "Mr. Barrington committed fraud years ago alongside Gerald Fenwick and Edward Lansing. When discovery threatened, he faked his death." Charles lowered his eyes miserably. "His wife assisted him," Miss Marple continued gently. "The insurance money and hidden accounts supported them afterward." Clara remained silent, but eventually Edward Lansing returned and began blackmailing them. Inspector Graves nodded. "All of which we know." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but none of it explains murder properly." She folded her knitting carefully. "Because blackmail rarely leads immediately to killing. Human beings usually attempt compromise first, payments." Her eyes moved slowly around the room, which is exactly what happened. Diana whispered suddenly, "Then who killed Edward?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, the important question is not who hated Edward Lansing." She paused. "Many people did. The important question is who feared exposure most urgently now." Silence. Then Miss Marple turned toward Hugh Lambert. The young solicitor looked startled. "Mr. Lambert," she said gently, "you are advising Clara Barrington legally. You also handled certain property matters for Gerald Fenwick." Hugh frowned slightly. "Some minor affairs, yes, and you had access to his papers." The room seemed to tighten subtly. Inspector Graves looked sharply toward Hugh now. Miss Marple continued softly, "You see, everyone assumed the ledger concerned old fraud alone, but it contained something newer. No one moved. Gerald Fenwick had discovered additional theft." Hugh went completely still. Miss Marple watched him kindly. "Small amounts at first, misappropriated trust funds, cleverly concealed." Mrs. Pritchard gasped aloud. Inspector Graves said slowly, "My God." Hugh stood abruptly. "That's absurd." "No," said Miss Marple quietly. "Merely sad." Diana stared at him in horror. "Hugh!" He looked at her desperately. "You don't understand." "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple softly. "I think I do." She laid aside her knitting entirely now. "You are not naturally criminal, Mr. Lambert. That is why everything became so untidy." Her voice remained gentle. "The shot fired near Diana missed deliberately because you wished to frighten her away from questions." Hugh's face had gone gray. "You planted her initials in the ledger." "No." "And you searched Hawthorne House after Fenwick hid the evidence?" Then Miss Marple said the final thing quietly. "Gerald Fenwick intended to expose you." For one terrible moment nobody breathed. At last Hugh whispered, "He ruined people's lives." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but that does not excuse murder." Hugh looked toward Diana helplessly. "I loved you." The words sounded almost childish. Diana stared as though she no longer recognized him. Inspector Graves moved slowly forward. "Mr. Lambert." But Hugh suddenly laughed, a dreadful sound. "You still don't see everything." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened instantly. "What do you mean?" His gaze shifted toward Clara Barrington, and for the first time since entering the room genuine emotion crossed her face. Not for herself, for him. Miss Marple understood instantly. "Oh," she said softly, "not lovers, mother and son." The resemblance emerged suddenly, once seen the same eyes, the same controlled mouth. Hugh spoke through clenched teeth. "My father abandoned us with debts and disgrace. Clara spent years surviving because of men like Fenwick." His voice cracked. "When Gerald discovered the missing trust funds, he threatened ruin all over again." Inspector Graves stared at Clara. "You concealed this relationship?" "Yes," she said quietly. "Why?" "Because Hugh believed respectability mattered." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. There it was, the final hidden motive. Not greed alone. Family. The oldest reasons for murder in the world. Inspector Graves spoke carefully. "You killed Edward Lansing?" Hugh nodded once. "He recognized me from London." He guessed Clara's connection. His voice sounded empty now. He threatened exposure. "And Fenwick?" "He was going to the police." Diana covered her face silently. Miss Marple watched Hugh with deep sadness. He was not wicked in the theatrical sense, merely weak, frightened, proud, like so many murderers before him. At last he looked toward Miss Marple. "How did you know?" She sighed softly. "My dear boy, because you were too kind." Everyone stared. Miss Marple folded her hands. Truly ruthless people do not fire warning shots. They do not panic afterward. And they do not keep trying to protect women from ugly truths. Outside the window, evening sunlight rested softly over Rosehill. The village looked peaceful once more. But inside the little drawing-room, lives had collapsed forever. After Hugh Lambert's arrest, Rosehill entered a strange and subdued quietness. It was not relief exactly. Relief belonged to simpler tragedies. This was something heavier, the slow recognition that evil had lived politely among them for years, attending church bazaars and discussing roses and borrowing teaspoons without anyone truly seeing it. Miss Marple, sitting beside her window 3 days later, reflected that villages never recovered from murder as completely as people imagined. They merely resumed routines around the wound. Outside, the summer afternoon drifted peacefully through the lanes. Children bicycled past the post office. Mrs. Bellamy argued with the butcher about bacon thickness. Somewhere beyond the cottages, lawn-mowers buzzed steadily. Ordinary life persisted with remarkable stubbornness. Yet beneath it all, Rosehill had changed. People spoke more cautiously now. Doors closed a little earlier. And whenever Hugh Lambert's name arose, which happened constantly, despite everyone pretending otherwise, voices lowered instinctively. Miss Marple knitted quietly and thought about sorrow, because murder did not end with arrest. That, she reflected, was the thing detective novels often misunderstood. The real damage came afterward. Inspector Graves visited that evening carrying a box of respectable chocolates, which he presented awkwardly, like a man uncertain whether gratitude ought to be formal. "You were right," he admitted. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One rarely enjoys being right about murder." The inspector sat down wearily. "Hugh Lambert confessed fully this morning. He says Edward Lansing confronted him accidentally near the Fair grounds after speaking with Fenwick. That sounds likely. Lansing recognized Hugh from years ago in London. Apparently Hugh had occasionally visited his mother during the fraud investigation." Miss Marple nodded quietly. "And Fenwick?" The inspector sighed. "Fenwick discovered irregularities in one of the legal trust accounts several months ago. At first he said nothing because exposing Hugh risked reopening the entire Barrington affair." "Mutually assured destruction," murmured Miss Marple. "Exactly." Inspector Graves rubbed his forehead tiredly. "But once Lansing returned and began blackmailing everyone, Fenwick panicked. He intended to turn over the ledger eventually. And Hugh found out." The inspector glanced toward her. "You knew long before the end, didn't you?" Miss Marple considered that carefully. "Numero. Not long." She threaded wool calmly through her fingers. "But I became suspicious after the shot fired at Diana, because it missed. Real killers do not usually miss frightened girls standing alone in narrow lanes." Inspector Graves smiled reluctantly. "You make murder sound almost practical." "My dear inspector," said Miss Marple gently, "murder is practical. That is what makes it dreadful." There was silence for a moment. Then the inspector said, "What about Clara Barrington?" Miss Marple's needles paused softly. "Ah, yes. She'll likely face charges related to the original fraud and insurance scheme, but not murder." "No." Inspector Graves leaned back slowly. "She protected her son, even after learning what he'd done." Miss Marple looked out the window toward the fading evening light. "Mothers often do." The inspector said nothing. After a moment, Miss Marple added quietly, "That does not make it right, of course." "No." "But it makes it understandable. Inspector Graves rose eventually to leave. At the door he hesitated. "You know," he said, "when I first met you I thought you were simply an observant old lady." Miss Marple smiled. "My dear Inspector, I am simply an observant old lady." He laughed softly. "No," he said, "I think you're rather dangerous." When he had gone, Miss Marple returned to her knitting thoughtfully. How odd men were! All her life people had underestimated elderly women because they seemed harmless. Yet old women observed everything. That was their great social advantage. Diana Harwood came to Rose Cottage the following afternoon. She looked thinner already. Grief, Miss Marple reflected sadly, altered young faces very quickly. "I'm leaving Rose Hill," Diana said quietly. Miss Marple nodded. "I thought perhaps you might." "There's nothing here now." "No." Diana sat silently for a while beside the garden window. At last she whispered, "I really loved him." Miss Marple did not pretend confusion. She knew Diana meant Hugh. Not because he deserved love, simply because human beings rarely loved sensibly. "My dear child," she said gently, "loving someone is not the same thing as approving of them." Diana stared down at her hands. "I keep thinking there must have been a moment when he could have stopped." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "There usually is." "And why don't people?" Miss Marple laid her knitting aside. "Because that question mattered. Perhaps more than all the others." "Fear," she said at last. Diana looked up. "Fear. Fear of disgrace. Fear of losing comfort. Fear of truth." Miss Marple's voice remained mild. "Very few people become murderers suddenly, my dear. Most simply continue making smaller selfish choices until one terrible choice seems natural." Tears filled Diana's eyes silently. "I should have known." "No," said Miss Marple gently, "you should not. But everyone says there were signs. There are always signs afterward." That, Miss Marple thought, was another cruel thing about tragedy. Once truth emerged, people rearranged memory to make disaster appear obvious. Yet beforehand wickedness rarely announced itself dramatically. It arrived politely, smiling, respectable, very often charming. Diana rose at last. Before leaving she hesitated near the door. "Were you ever afraid?" Miss Marple looked surprised. "During all this?" "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple honestly. "Several times." Diana blinked. "But you never seem frightened." "My dear," said Miss Marple with a faint smile, "elderly ladies have spent most of their lives being frightened sensibly. One becomes practiced." For the first time in days Diana laughed softly. Then she kissed Miss Marple's cheek and left. Later that evening Miss Marple walked slowly along Orchard Lane. The chestnut trees rustled gently overhead. Late sunlight flickered through the leaves onto the gravel path where Edward Lansing had died. The village looked almost exactly as it had before the fete, yet not quite, never quite. Miss Marple paused near the hedge. Human beings, she reflected, always imagined evil as something extraordinary, monstrous faces, violent tempers, dramatic cruelty. But the most dangerous people were often merely weak, weak enough to lie, weak enough to steal, weak enough to kill when cornered. She thought of Hugh Lambert's pale, frightened face, of Clara Barrington's cold intelligence, of Gerald Fenwick running desperately through the dark because he understood too late that blackmail had become murder. And she thought, too, of Edward Lansing, unpleasant, greedy, dishonest Edward Lansing, whose death had begun the unraveling of everything. Poor man, she thought suddenly. Even blackmailers were human beings once. A breeze stirred softly through the trees. Far away the church bell struck 6. Miss Marple turned back toward the village. There would be tea soon. Mrs. Bellamy would undoubtedly overbake something tomorrow. Colonel Ashcombe would continue talking nonsense about criminal conspiracies. Mrs. Pritchard would preserve the entire affair permanently in gossip. Life would go on. It always did. And somewhere beneath the peaceful habits of English village life, human nature would remain exactly as it had always been. Which Miss Marple reflected as she walked slowly homeward through the golden evening light, was why there would always be mysteries for observant old ladies to solve. By August, the murder case had already begun its gradual transformation into village legend. Miss Marple often thought this process rather indecent. People who had once trembled with fear now discussed events comfortably over sponge cake. Details altered with repetition. Timelines softened. Motives became theatrical. Reality was untidy and sorrowful. Memory preferred entertainment. The vicarage garden party took place on a warm Thursday afternoon beneath a sky of pale blue cloud and drifting sunlight. White tables stood across the lawn, crowded with tea trays and bowls of strawberries. Bees wandered lazily among the roses. It was, outwardly at least, a return to normality. Miss Marple sat beneath a striped parasol beside Mrs. Bantry. "My dear Jane," said Dolly happily, "everyone says the village feels itself again." Miss Marple looked over the lawn thoughtfully. Colonel Ashcombe was loudly correcting someone about police procedure. Mrs. Pritchard had gathered an attentive audience near the lemonade table and was clearly recounting the affair for perhaps the 50th time. Meanwhile, several younger women were pretending not to speculate about Diana Harwood's future. "Yes," said Miss Marple mildly, "that is what people generally say." Dolly glanced sideways at her. "You disagree?" "My dear, villages never truly become themselves again after murder." Miss Marple adjusted her knitting calmly. "They merely become accustomed to remembering." Mrs. Bantry considered this with unusual seriousness. "That sounds rather sad." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "it is." The band near the church hedge began attempting light music with mixed success. Children ran shrieking across the grass. Ordinary life, Miss Marple reflected, possessed remarkable determination. Inspector Graves arrived shortly afterward, looking distinctly uncomfortable in summer formal clothes. "You came," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "You invited me. That does not always guarantee success." He smiled reluctantly. Mrs. Bantry immediately abandoned subtlety. "Tell us everything." "There's very little left to tell. People say Clara Barrington still refuses to speak to her son." Inspector Graves hesitated. "That's true." Miss Marple's needles paused softly. "How very tragic." The inspector nodded. "Hugh keeps asking to see her. She declines every time." Mrs. Bantry looked shocked. "But after everything she did to protect him." "Yes," said Inspector Graves quietly. "After everything." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Then she observed gently, "Sometimes people can forgive wickedness more easily than weakness." The inspector stared at her thoughtfully. Across the lawn, Mrs. Pritchard's voice drifted loudly through the afternoon air. "And naturally I suspected something from the very beginning." "No, you didn't," muttered Colonel Ashcombe. Mrs. Bantry brightened. "Do you know, Jane, I almost miss the excitement." Miss Marple looked mildly scandalized. "My dear Dolly, that is because nobody shot at you." Later, as the party drifted lazily toward evening, Miss Marple wandered slowly into the vicarage garden beyond the main lawn. The roses there were particularly lovely that year, deep crimson against old brick walls. She found Diana Harwood sitting alone beneath the pear tree. For a moment neither spoke. Then Diana said quietly, "I almost didn't come." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but hiding forever would become exhausting." Diana smiled faintly. She looked stronger now, though sadness lingered about her face like a shadow not entirely faded. "I've accepted a position in Bath," she said.
How nice.
"It seems sensible to leave Rosehill." Diana looked down at her hands. "Do you think people ever stop talking about these things?" Miss Marple considered carefully. "Not entirely." Diana sighed. "I was afraid you'd say that. My dear child, villages survive through conversation. Without gossip, half the inhabitants would perish from emotional starvation." Diana laughed softly despite herself. Then her expression grew serious again. "I still keep thinking about Hugh. I know what he did was terrible. But sometimes—" she hesitated painfully. "Sometimes I remember how frightened he looked near the end." Miss Marple sat quietly beside her. "My dear," she said gently, "goodness and weakness are not opposites. That is one of the saddest truths about human beings." Diana's eyes filled slightly. "I wanted him to be entirely monstrous. It would make things easier." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Unfortunately, people are rarely consistent enough for that." A breeze stirred through the garden. From the lawn beyond came distant laughter and the clinking of teacups. At last Diana asked,
"Will you miss me?"
Miss Marple smiled warmly. "Of course. You ask much more intelligent questions than most people here." That earned another laugh. Then Diana leaned forward suddenly and kissed Miss Marple's cheek.
"Thank you," she whispered.
"For what?" "For seeing things properly." Miss Marple watched her walk slowly back toward the party. Poor child, she thought. The young always imagined truth brought peace. Usually it merely brought clarity. Evening settled softly over Rosehill after the guests departed. The vicarage lawn lay scattered with abandoned paper cups and folding chairs. Somewhere in the distance church bells drifted faintly across the fields. Miss Marple walked home alone along Orchard Lane. The chestnut trees cast long shadows in the golden dusk. Near the hedge where Edward Lansing had died, she paused once more. How strange it seemed that so much suffering had begun there from one brief meeting between frightened men. A stranger arriving in a dusty green motor car, a quiet conversation, and beneath it all years of concealed greed and fear waiting patiently to emerge. Miss Marple looked upward through the branches overhead. Human nature never altered. That was the comforting thing about it, oddly enough. Cruel, perhaps, but comforting. Because once one understood human beings properly, mysteries became solvable. Not easy, never easy, but understandable. Far down the lane, lights glowed warmly from cottage windows. Someone was playing piano badly. A dog barked lazily near the green. Life continuing. Always continuing. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself and resumed walking homeward through the fading summer light, her knitting bag tucked neatly beneath her arm. And in Rose Hill at last peace imperfect, human, and fragile settled quietly once more over Orchard Lane. September arrived gently in Rose Hill. The roses faded first, then the long golden evenings shortened almost without warning. Leaves began collecting along Orchard Lane in little drifting corners beneath the hedges. Smoke returned to cottage chimneys during cool mornings. Miss Marple always liked autumn. It encouraged reflection. Summer concealed too much beneath brightness and noise, whereas autumn revealed things quietly weakened branches, neglected gardens, tired faces. Human beings were much the same. One crisp afternoon, nearly 6 weeks after the affair's conclusion, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Clara Barrington. The former Mrs. Barrington arrived without luggage and without announcement, dressed simply in dark gray. She looked older now, not dramatically, merely tired. Miss Marple admitted her without surprise. "I wondered if you might come eventually," she said gently. Clara removed her gloves carefully. "You usually expect people." "Yes," said Miss Marple mildly. "Human beings are very repetitive." They sat together in the little drawing-room while rain tapped softly at the windows. For a few moments Clara said nothing. Then she asked quietly, "Do you despise me?" Miss Marple considered the question honestly. "No." Clara looked faintly surprised. "Most people do." "My dear," said Miss Marple softly, "most people prefer simple moral judgments because they are restful. And you do not."
"No."
Miss Marple poured tea calmly. "I merely think you made terrible choices." Clara accepted the cup silently. After a moment she said, "I love my son very much, and I ruined him." The words came flatly, without self-pity. Miss Marple looked at her carefully. "Not entirely." Clara laughed once under her breath. "That sounds charitable. It is merely accurate." Rain blurred the garden beyond the windows. At last Clara said, "Hugh always wanted respectability. Even as a boy." Her mouth tightened faintly. "Children are very cruel about disgrace." Miss Marple nodded. "When Charles disappeared, I told myself I was protecting Hugh." Clara stared into her untouched tea. "Then years passed and the lies became ordinary." "That often happens." "And afterward—" She stopped briefly. "Afterward I could no longer tell whether I was protecting him or protecting myself." Miss Marple said nothing, because there was no comfort possible for that kind of truth. At length Clara reached into her handbag and withdrew an envelope. "There are additional documents," she said quietly, "accounts your inspector never found." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows slightly. "You wish to surrender them?" "Why now?" Clara looked toward the rain-dark garden. "Because I'm tired." Such a simple answer, and probably entirely true. Miss Marple accepted the envelope gently. "You know," she said after a moment, "truly wicked people rarely become tired of deception." Clara gave her a strange look. "Then perhaps I was never truly wicked." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "I don't think you were." The other woman's eyes filled suddenly with tears she seemed almost astonished to feel. Miss Marple pretended not to notice. That, too, was part of kindness. After Clara departed, Miss Marple sat for a long while beside the fire without knitting. The envelope rested unopened on the table beside her. Outside, rain continued falling steadily across Rose Hill. Poor woman, she thought. People imagined crime emerged from dramatic passions, hatred, revenge, greed. But far more often it grew from exhaustion. One compromise, then another. One lie to protect someone, then 20 more to preserve the first, until eventually ordinary decency disappeared beneath accumulated fear. Miss Marple sighed softly. Human beings were such fragile creatures. Several days later Inspector Graves visited again. He looked healthier now that Rose Hill contained fewer corpses. "She came to see you," he said, "and handed over more evidence." Miss Marple nodded. The inspector settled into his chair comfortably. "You know, most people would have concealed those documents permanently." But she didn't. No. Inspector Graves frowned thoughtfully. I still don't entirely understand her. Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear Inspector, motherhood is not always a reasonable condition. That's hardly an explanation for fraud and conspiracy. No, agreed Miss Marple. But it is an explanation for many foolish things. The inspector laughed softly. Then his expression turned more serious. Hugh Lambert asked about Diana again. Miss Marple's needle slowed. He wanted to know whether she'd left Rose Hill happily. How sad. Inspector Graves hesitated. He said something curious. What was that? The inspector glanced toward the fire. He said the worst moment wasn't killing Fenwick. Miss Marple looked up sharply. What then? It was realizing afterward that Diana feared him. Silence settled briefly through the little room. At last Miss Marple said quietly, because that, she thought, was the true punishment awaiting certain criminals, not prison. Recognition. The terrible moment when they understood what they had become in the eyes of someone they loved. Late that afternoon, Miss Marple walked slowly through the village. Autumn leaves scattered across the green. Shopkeepers were already discussing winter coal deliveries. Somewhere nearby, children practiced hymns badly for Harvest Festival. Rose Hill looked peaceful once more, perhaps as peaceful as it ever could. Mrs. Pritchard waved eagerly from the post-office doorway. Miss Marple, have you heard? Mrs. Bellamy's nephew is courting the chemist's daughter. Really? Said Miss Marple polite. And apparently there was a dreadful disagreement over a fruitcake recipe. How alarming. Mrs. Pritchard lowered her voice conspiratorially. I suspect there'll be trouble. Miss Marple smiled gently. Yes, she said, there usually is. She continued along Orchard Lane afterward beneath the drifting yellow leaves. The hedge where Edward Lansing died looked entirely ordinary now. No trace remained. That was another strange thing about murder. Places forgot more quickly than people. Miss Marple paused briefly, listening to the soft rustling branches overhead. Then she resumed walking slowly homeward through the cool autumn dusk. Behind lace curtains and tidy gardens, Rose Hill's inhabitants continued loving, lying, gossiping, envying, forgiving, fearing all the ordinary complicated habits of human beings, which meant, Miss Marple reflected with quiet certainty, that mysteries would never truly disappear from villages like this, not while human nature remained what it was. Winter came early that year. By November, frost silvered the hedges each morning, and smoke drifted steadily above the chimneys of Rose Hill. Orchard Lane stood bare beneath skeletal chestnut branches, while the gardens retreated into quietness under cold grey skies. Miss Marple did not mind winter. Old age, she thought, inclined one naturally toward quieter seasons. There were compensations in growing old which younger people never imagined. One became invisible in agreeable ways. One was permitted silence, and one learned eventually that most human troubles repeated themselves endlessly under slightly different names. It was during one such cold afternoon that Miss Marple sat beside the fire with her knitting while the village prepared for the Christmas bazaar. From outside came the muffled sounds of ordinary life continuing. The butcher's cart rattling over frozen ground, children shouting near the green, Mrs. Bellamy arguing loudly about holly arrangements, life persisting stubborn and comforting. A letter rested open beside Miss Marple's teacup. It had arrived that morning from Diana Harwood in Bath. The handwriting was steadier now. I think perhaps I am beginning to feel ordinary again, Diana had written. Miss Marple smiled faintly at that. Ordinary life was greatly underrated. The young longed for romance and excitement, but peace, real peace, was much rarer and far more valuable. The fire crackled softly. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted, as they sometimes did, back through the events of that terrible summer. Edward Lansing stepping from the dusty green motor-car. Gerald Fenwick's face tightening with fear. The soft rustling leaves along Orchard Lane before violence shattered everything. And afterward the unraveling of years of deception. How strange people were. Charles Barrington had feared poverty. Clara Barrington had feared disgrace. Hugh Lambert had feared humiliation. Gerald Fenwick had feared exposure. And Edward Lansing had feared losing money he had no right to possess at all. Fear everywhere. That, Miss Marple reflected, was the true root beneath many crimes. Not wickedness exactly, weakness. Human beings feared suffering so intensely that they often created far worse suffering in escape. A knock sounded gently at the cottage door. Mrs. Bantry entered in a whirl of cold air and enthusiasm. "My dear Jane, the village choir has become impossible." "How unfortunate." They've quarrelled over the nativity tableau. That sounds serious. It is serious. Mrs. Finch insists her grandson must be one of the wise men. Miss Marple nodded gravely. Ambition is always dangerous. Mrs. Bantry laughed and settled herself near the fire. For a while they discussed village matters, leaking roofs, unsuitable engagements, the vicar's unfortunate sermon on moderation delivered beside 3-tiered cake trays. Ordinary gossip, comfortable gossip. At last Dolly said quietly, "You know, I still think about Hugh Lambert sometimes." Miss Marple's knitting slowed. "He seemed such a nice young man." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "That is often how these things begin." Mrs. Bantry shivered slightly. "It's dreadful to think one never truly knows people." Miss Marple considered that carefully. Then she shook her head. "Oh, I think one often does know them." Her voice remained mild. "The difficulty is that people usually contain several contradictory truths simultaneously." Dolly blinked. "That sounds complicated." "My dear, people are complicated." The firelight flickered warmly across the room. Outside, dusk settled slowly over Rose Hill. Mrs. Bantry glanced toward the window. "Do you suppose there'll be another murder some day?" Miss Marple sighed softly. "My dear Dolly, I sincerely hope not. But—" Miss Marple laid her knitting gently in her lap. "But wherever human beings gather together in villages, families, trains, tea-shops, there will always be vanity, resentment, greed, fear, love, loneliness, and pride." She smiled faintly. "And unfortunately those things do occasionally lead to murder." Mrs. Bantry stared at her. "Jane, you make humanity sound exhausting." "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple cheerfully. "It frequently is." They both laughed then, and somehow the laughter mattered. Because that, Miss Marple thought afterward, was another thing detective stories often neglected. People continued living, even after grief, even after betrayal. Human beings possessed an extraordinary ability to carry sorrow while still discussing jam recipes and Christmas puddings. Perhaps that was why civilization survived at all. Later that evening, after Mrs. Bantry departed, Miss Marple stood briefly beside the window overlooking Orchard Lane. Snow had begun falling softly through the darkness. The village lamps glowed golden against the white drifting air. Peaceful, very peaceful. Yet Miss Marple knew better than most that peace was never the absence of darkness. It was merely the fragile balance ordinary people created despite darkness. She thought of Clara Barrington somewhere alone with her regrets, of Hugh Lambert facing long years of remembering, of Diana Harwood learning slowly how to trust happiness again, and of all the small unnoticed choices that had led each of them toward tragedy. Human nature never altered. That truth saddened her sometimes, but it also reassured her, because if people remained foolish and frightened and hopeful generation after generation, then kindness mattered too. Small kindnesses especially. A cup of tea offered gently, a question asked patiently, an old woman listening carefully while others hurried past. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Then she drew the curtains against the snow, stirred the fire, and returned to her knitting while winter settled softly over Rose Hill and Orchard Lane lay silent beneath the falling dark. Christmas arrived quietly in Rose Hill beneath snow-covered rooftops and chimneys breathing pale smoke into the winter air. The village church bells rang warmly across frozen fields on Christmas Eve, while lanterns glowed softly behind curtained windows. Children dragged sledges along Orchard Lane, and every cottage seemed to smell faintly of pine needles, coal fires, and baking. To outsiders, Rose Hill looked untouched by tragedy. Miss Marple knew better. Villagers remembered everything, not openly perhaps, not forever in conversation, but memories settled into places the way frost settled into stone, thin, persistent, impossible to remove entirely. That afternoon Miss Marple was arranging holly beside the mantelpiece when there came a knock at the cottage door. She opened it to find Inspector Graves standing outside in the snow. "My dear Inspector," she said, "you look frozen." "I probably am." "Then come in immediately before you become decorative." He laughed softly and stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. The warmth of the cottage wrapped around them almost instantly. Firelight flickered across polished furniture and shelves crowded with books and wool baskets. "You've timed your visit perfectly," Miss Marple informed him. "Tea is ready." Inspector Graves removed his gloves gratefully. "I sometimes think tea is your solution to everything." "My dear man," said Miss Marple mildly, "civilization itself is largely maintained by tea." That appeared difficult to argue with. They settled beside the fire while snow drifted steadily beyond the windows. For a little while they spoke only of ordinary things, village decorations, the choir service, Colonel Ashcombe's disastrous attempt to organize carol singers with military precision. Then the inspector grew quieter. "I visited Hugh Lambert yesterday." Miss Marple's knitting slowed gently. "Yes?" "He asked me to give you something." Inspector Graves removed a folded envelope from his coat pocket. Miss Marple took it without speaking. The handwriting on the front was careful and restrained. After a moment she opened it. Inside was a brief letter. "Dear Miss Marple, I do not expect forgiveness, nor do I deserve it, but I wish to thank you for one kindness. You saw me clearly before the end, more clearly, perhaps, than I ever saw myself. That is painful, but it is also strangely merciful. Please tell Diana nothing further about me. She deserves peace. Hugh Lambert." The room remained very quiet after Miss Marple finished reading. At last Inspector Graves asked softly, "What do you think he meant?" Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. "I think," she said, "that some people only become honest after everything else has been taken away from them." The inspector stared into the fire. "He still insists he loved Diana." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently, "I believe he did, and yet he murdered 2 men. Inspector Graves shook his head slowly. "I'll never understand how those things fit together." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Inspector, love does not improve human character nearly as much as poets claim." Snow tapped softly against the windows. The fire crackled warmly, and for a long while neither spoke. Later that evening, after the inspector departed, Miss Marple walked slowly down Orchard Lane, wrapped in her heavy winter coat. Snow covered the hedges and softened the road into pale silver beneath the moonlight. The village was quiet now. Only distant church bells drifted through the frozen air. Miss Marple paused near the place where Edward Lansing had died months before. How extraordinary it seemed that everything had begun there, one stranger arriving unexpectedly, one frightened conversation, and beneath it all years of hidden fear waiting patiently to emerge. She thought of all the people touched by it. Charles Barrington living in cowardly exile, Clara sacrificing morality piece by piece in the name of protection, Diana carrying heartbreak into adulthood, Hugh Lambert discovering too late that fear could turn love poisonous, and Gerald Fenwick dishonest, selfish Gerald Fenwick running desperately from consequences he himself had helped create. No one had been entirely innocent, but no one perhaps had been entirely monstrous either. That, Miss Marple reflected sadly, was what made life so difficult. Human beings rarely belonged completely to darkness or light, most simply wandered uncertainly between the two. A soft wind moved through the bare chestnut branches overhead. Miss Marple drew her coat closer and began walking home again through the snow. Warm light glowed ahead from the windows of Rose Cottage. Firelight, small comforts against the coldness of the world. And suddenly Miss Marple felt very old, not unhappy, merely aware of how many sorrows human beings carried through their brief lives. Aware, too, that kindness remained worthwhile despite everything. Perhaps because of everything. When she reached the cottage gate, she paused once more and looked back down Orchard Lane. Snow continued falling silently across Rose Hill, covering footsteps, softening edges, allowing the village at last to rest. Then Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself and went indoors, closing the door gently against the winter night. By March, winter had begun loosening its grip upon Rose Hill. The snow vanished first from Orchard Lane, retreating slowly beneath pale sunlight and steady rain. Then crocuses appeared beside cottage walls, followed by daffodils nodding brightly in the churchyard, as though nothing sorrowful had ever happened there at all. Miss Marple always found spring faintly miraculous. Human beings, she reflected, were rarely half so sensible as gardens. Gardens understood perfectly that harsh seasons passed eventually. One cool afternoon she sat beneath the open window of Rose Cottage with her knitting resting untouched in her lap, while sparrows argued noisily in the hedge outside. The village sounded alive again, children laughing near the green, bicycles rattling over stones, Mrs. Bellamy calling loudly after her escaped terrier. Ordinary sounds, peaceful sounds. A letter lay open beside Miss Marple's teacup, another from Diana. The young woman seemed happier now in Bath. There was mention of new friends, long walks beside the river, and rather cautiously a young doctor who apparently possessed a very calming sort of kindness. Miss Marple smiled faintly at that phrase. Calm kindness, she thought, was greatly underrated in romance. The young often mistook intensity for love, usually with disastrous results. A soft knock sounded at the cottage door. Colonel Ashcombe entered without waiting properly for invitation, carrying an enormous bunch of early tulips. "My housekeeper insists these are excessive," he announced defensively. "She is probably correct," said Miss Marple. "Rubbish. Flowers improve morale." Miss Marple accepted them graciously. The colonel settled himself near the window with the satisfied air of a man performing civilization. "You know," he said after a moment, "people are finally speaking of other things again. The village fete committee has resumed arguing about bunting. How reassuring." Colonel Ashcombe glanced toward Orchard Lane thoughtfully. "Strange business altogether." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Very strange." The colonel frowned. "I still cannot reconcile Hugh Lambert with murder. No. He always seemed so respectable." Miss Marple threaded wool calmly through her fingers. "My dear Colonel, respectability and goodness are not identical." The colonel considered that uneasily. Dashed uncomfortable thought. "Yes," admitted Miss Marple. "Truth often is." For a while they sat quietly together while sunlight drifted warmly across the garden outside. At last the colonel rose to leave. At the door he hesitated awkwardly. "You did a remarkable thing, you know." Miss Marple looked surprised. "I merely notice things." "No," said Colonel Ashcombe quietly. "You notice people—" After he'd gone, Miss Marple remained still for several moments. Then she smiled faintly to herself, because that, perhaps, was the real difference. Clues mattered, certainly, but people mattered more. Human beings always reveal themselves eventually through fear, vanity, kindness, cruelty, weakness, or love. One simply had to observe patiently. That evening Miss Marple walked slowly along Orchard Lane for what she suspected might be the final time connected to those terrible events. The chestnut trees were beginning to bud again overhead. Bird-song drifted softly through the cooling air. Near the hedge where Edward Lansing died, fresh grass had already begun covering the last worn traces left by policemen's boots months earlier. Nature forgot quickly, people less so. Miss Marple paused there quietly. How strange the whole affair seemed now. A stranger arriving unexpectedly, a frightened man trying desperately to protect his secrets, and behind everything, ordinary human weaknesses growing slowly into tragedy. Fear of shame, fear of poverty, fear of losing love, such small beginnings for such terrible endings. Miss Marple sighed softly. Yet perhaps there was comfort too in understanding that evil rarely arrived as something monstrous and foreign. More often it emerged from ordinary hearts making selfish, frightened choices one after another. That truth was sad. But it was also useful, because once one accepted human nature honestly, one could still choose kindness despite it. A breeze stirred gently through the lane. Far away, church bells rang the hour. Miss Marple turned back toward Rose Cottage, where warm lamplight already glowed through the windows. Home, tea waiting, knitting beside the fire. The small, peaceful rituals that made life bearable after sorrow. As she walked slowly homeward, Miss Marple reflected that mysteries would never truly disappear from villages like Rose Hill. So long as human beings loved unwisely, feared disgrace, envied neighbors, concealed truths, and longed desperately to appear better than they were, there would always be secrets. And somewhere nearby, perhaps, there would always need to be an observant old lady quietly listening while others talked too much. Miss Marple smiled faintly at the thought. Then she opened the cottage gate, stepped inside, and closed it gently behind her while evening settled peacefully at last over Rose Hill, and Orchard Lane lay calm beneath the first tender promise of spring.